In the deep woods of Appalachia, a person can walk for hours without seeing a road, a house, or another human face. But the forest is rarely quiet. An axe falls where no logging crew is working. A voice crosses a hollow after the last porch light has gone dark. Tonight on Fear Wilderness, 8 witnesses describe the moments when the familiar woods around them became impossible to recognize. Story 1. Lena Ward woke before sunrise because an acorn had found the loose corner of the tower roof. It rolled above her bunk whenever the wind shifted, stopped for a moment, then rolled back. She had meant to climb up and remove it for 3 mornings. Instead, she lay beneath 2 wool blankets and listened until the small sound became part of the weather. The Black Laurel Fire Tower stood on a ridge in the central Appalachians, 14 miles from the nearest paved road. In daylight, Lena could see folded mountains fading from green to blue. At night, the hollows below became solid black channels between the ridges. A porch light sometimes appeared near Miller Creek, but even that vanished when the leaves thickened. Lena made coffee in a blue enamel pot with a dent shaped like a thumb. While it heated, she measured the rain gauge, checked the barometer, and wiped condensation from the windows with an old flour sack. She recorded each reading in block letters because Ben Harlan, the district dispatcher, claimed her usual handwriting looked like pine needles dropped on paper. At 7, Ben called over the radio. "Morning, Black Laurel. Clear up here. Haze in the south hollow." "Wind?" Lena looked at the faded cloth tied beneath the eastern railing. "Enough to move a lie, not enough to move a leaf." Ben made the same short laugh he gave her every morning. Then he read the fire risk and reminded her that a dry front was expected by Friday. Neither of them trusted the forecast. Rain often split around Black Laurel, as if the ridge were pushing it aside. She ate an apple with peanut butter and saved the core in a glass jar so mice would not find it. Her father had packed the apples from the tree behind his house. He chose the bruised ones for Lena because she ate around the soft spots and never complained. Once each afternoon, she stood against the west railing where her phone found one thin bar of service and sent him a photograph of the sky. He always replied with the same question, "You drinking enough water?" Lena always wrote yes, even when the full jug was still under her bunk. Most days were divided between watching and walking. She watched for smoke from the cab. Then she walked the ridge trail to check old fire rings, lightning scars, and deadfall that could block an engine crew. She carried a topographic map in a plastic sleeve and marked each inspected site with a yellow grease pencil. A short line meant clear, a circle meant return with tools, an X meant report it before dark. That Tuesday, she marked an X beside an illegal fire ring at Lost Fork. The stones were still black, though no ash lifted when she stirred them with a branch. Someone had left a green bottle beneath the leaves and a strip of bacon draped over a rock. Lena poured water into the cold pit, packed the bottle out, and tied a length of orange tape to a beech limb above the trail. She returned to the tower near sunset. The steps rang beneath her boots. Each metal flight had its own note, and Lena knew them well enough to tell where a visitor was standing before seeing them. The lower flights gave a dull knock. The upper landing answered with a thin vibration that passed through the tower legs. No visitors came that evening. After dark, Lena warmed soup and listened to the weather receiver beside the map table. The regular forecast ended just before 10. She reached to lower the volume. A burst of static came from the larger field radio. That unit was tuned to Channel 9, an old forestry frequency retired when the district replaced its mountaintop repeaters. Lena kept it selected because the other channels carried truck traffic from a quarry across the state line. Channel 9 usually held nothing but a soft electrical hiss. The hiss sharpened. A man began speaking in a flat, careful voice. "Black Laurel observation. Lost Fork, wind from the west, fire ring cold. Orange marker above the eastern approach." Lena held the soup spoon halfway to her mouth. The voice stopped. Static filled the cab for 3 seconds, followed by the click of an open microphone. Somewhere behind that open channel, water moved over stone. Then the radio went quiet. Lena called Ben on the district frequency. "Did you transmit on 9? 9 has been dead longer than my truck." She told him what she had heard. Ben paused long enough for Lena to hear someone close a filing cabinet in his office. "Probably a hunter with old equipment," he said. "Write down the time." Lena did. She also copied the words exactly. Before sleeping, she checked the door latch twice and placed her boots beneath the bunk with their toes facing out. In the morning, fog filled the valleys. Only the highest ridges showed above it. They looked like islands resting on white water. Lena hiked north toward Crow's Shoulder, where a lightning strike had split a chestnut oak the previous week. The tree stood beside a steep slope covered in mountain laurel. Its trunk had opened from crown to roots, exposing pale wood that smelled sharp and clean. She found no heat in the split. She drew a short line beside the location and wrote "Safe Snag" in the margin. On the walk back, she stopped at Danner's store for batteries and kerosene. May Danner sat behind the counter with a paperback folded around one finger. She had lived below Black Laurel since before the tower stairs were painted silver. Lena mentioned the voice while May counted her change. The older woman placed the coins on the counter one at a time. Those towers used to talk after the men went home. Lena waited for her to smile. May closed the cash drawer. "Best not to answer unless you know who called." That night, Channel 9 opened at 10:16. First came the sound of wind pressing against a microphone. Leaves scraped together. Then the same measured voice returned. "Crow's Shoulder observation. Split oak secure. No heat at the roots. Yellow line on the western grid." Lena looked down at the map. The yellow mark was visible beneath her left hand. She picked up the microphone, then remembered May's face and set it back in its cradle. Instead, she held her phone near the speaker and recorded the transmission. When it ended, the forest outside had changed. The katydids had stopped. No owl called from the north slope. Lena could hear the faint ticking of the radio as its metal casing cooled. She sent the recording to Ben when her phone found service the next morning. He played it twice in the district office. The file contained static, Lena's breathing, and the scrape of her sleeve against the table. There was no voice. Ben drove up before noon. He checked the antenna, opened the radio housing, and examined every connection. Dust lay unbroken around the screws. "Receiver is clean," he said. Lena showed him the written reports. He read both pages without making his usual joke. Before leaving, he rested one hand on the doorframe. "If it says your name, come down." The dry front arrived on Thursday. Wind traveled along the ridge in long pushes, bending the crowns together and letting them rise. Lena spent the morning checking the access road. Half a mile below the tower, she found a dead hemlock leaning over the gravel. She marked a circle on the map and tied orange tape around the trunk so an engine crew could cut it later. Near the tower trail, she noticed a second strip of tape tied to a sapling. It was the same forestry orange, but the knot faced downhill. Lena used square knots. This one had been pulled tight with several turns, the way someone might bind a package. Beneath it, the leaves were pressed flat in a shape about the width of a boot. She called Ben. The ridge blocked her handheld signal, so she climbed back to the cab before reaching him. He promised to send a ranger at first light. Red flag conditions had already pulled every available crew toward a brush fire 2 counties east. At dusk, Lena drew an X at the tower itself and wrote unknown trail marker beside it. She did not want the detail lost among her other notes. Channel 9 came alive at 9:40. The first sound was not static. It was the ringing of a metal stair. One low note came through the speaker, then another, slightly higher. The sound moved upward one flight at a time. Lena stood beside the table and listened to the tower reproduce itself through the radio. A lower flight knocked beneath the cab. A moment later, the same knock came from the speaker. The delay was less than a second. She turned off the lamp. The steps continued. Their vibration reached the soles of her socks through the floor. Lena slid her boots on without tying them and took the emergency flare from the wall bracket. The voice entered beneath the ringing metal. Black Laurel observation. Unknown marker below the south approach. Yellow X at station. One light extinguished. Lena kept one hand on the door latch. Her thumb pushed so hard against the flare cap that the ridges marked her skin. The footsteps reached the upper landing and stopped. Wind moved around the cab. A loose wire tapped the western window. The radio microphone lifted slightly in its cradle, rocked once and settled. Lena waited for the door to move. Instead, the open channel carried her own breathing back to her. Each breath returned a fraction late. Beneath it came another breath, slower and rougher, as though the microphone were lying against wet leaves. She did not open the door. She did not answer the radio. For the next 4 hours, nothing climbed higher and nothing went back down. The tower remained still except for the wind. Shortly before dawn, the channel closed with a soft click. Ben arrived with Ranger Paul Vickers after sunrise. They found Lena sitting on the floor with her back against the map cabinet. Her boots were unlaced. The flare remained unopened across her knees. The upper landing was empty. Dew covered every stair from the ground to the cab. There were no prints where a boot would have broken it. Paul searched the slope and found the second strip of orange tape. He also found 6 more pieces tied in a straight line, descending through the laurel. The line ended at an old concrete footing half buried beside the creek. Ben recognized it from district records. A radio repeater had stood there until a flood undermined the road nearly 20 years earlier. The equipment had been removed. The tower supporting it had been cut apart and hauled away. In the mud beside the footing, water had collected inside several narrow impressions. Paul called them deer tracks. Lena did not correct him. Each impression was longer than her hand and ended in a flat edge. She came down from Black Laurel that morning and never worked another overnight watch. The district replaced the field radio, then the antenna, then the cable running beneath the cab. Channel 9 remained quiet during every test. Lena took a position at a state tree nursery where irrigation pumps and delivery trucks filled the day with ordinary noise. She still spoke with Ben each October. Neither of them mentioned the recording that held no voice. Years later, weather reports could still wake her from another room. She would hear a location, a wind direction, and a measured pause before the next observation. Her hands would stop over whatever they were doing until the speaker moved on. People who watch forests for a living learn to mark the places that may become dangerous. They also learn that a mark tells anyone who finds it exactly where a person has been. Even now, before Lena folds a map, she rubs away every symbol that shows where she is standing. Story 2. Owen Price began every workday by wrapping 3 rubber bands around his left wrist. One held the certified letters, one was for loose bundles, the third stayed clean for Mrs. Della Raines, who saved them around a flour jar and used them to close bags of dried beans. His route left the Pine Hook post office shortly after 8 and climbed into a chain of narrow Appalachian hollows where the road changed names without warning. Owen had carried mail there for 11 years. He knew which culverts flooded first and which gravel drives could support the weight of his truck after rain. He knew where sunlight reached the road in winter. He also knew where it never did. The old coal company had numbered the houses before the county named the lanes. Some addresses followed the road, others followed the order in which the houses had been built. A person could pass number 60, then number 12, then an empty foundation with 74 painted on the chimney. Navigation systems gave up near the first ridge. Owen did not need one. He sorted the route in his head by people Mrs. Raines came after the red cattle gate. Walter Klein lived beside the sycamore with a tire swing, though no child had used it in years. Irene Voss received her medicine on Thursdays and left a paper sack of walnuts in the mailbox when they were in season. At the Sutter place, Owen carried dog biscuits for an old hound named Chester, who barked at every vehicle but sat politely for the mail. His wife, Nora, packed his lunch in a faded metal box that had belonged to her father. She cut his tomato sandwiches diagonally and wrapped the halves separately because Owen ate one at noon and the other while driving the last ridge. On cold mornings, she slipped a hand warmer beneath his napkin. She never mentioned it, and he always brought it home unopened. The route had grown quieter over the years. Younger families moved toward town. Roofs sagged on the company houses. Kudzu climbed through windows and pulled porch railings toward the ground. Owen continued stopping at vacant mailboxes because forwarding orders expired and names sometimes returned. On a Monday in late November, he heard 3 hammer taps while placing a package on Mrs. Raines's porch. The sound came from uphill, beyond a row of abandoned houses. Each strike was clean and evenly spaced. Owen looked between the bare trees, but saw no workers or parked vehicles. After a pause, the hammer struck 3 more times. Mrs. Raines opened her door before he could knock. She wore a blue robe beneath a canvas coat. "Somebody fixing the Bell place?" Owen asked. She looked toward the hill. "Nobody owns enough of it to fix." Owen handed her the package. It contained the birdseed she ordered every month. Before leaving, he gave her the clean rubber band. The next morning, a new aluminum number had appeared on the Bell house. It read 118. Owen slowed his truck. 118 belonged to Irene Voss, half a mile farther up the hollow. Her number plate was painted wood, not aluminum, but the digits matched. The Bell house had been empty since a kitchen fire damaged the rear wall nearly 15 years earlier. He walked to the porch. The new plate had been fixed beside the door with bright screws. Sawdust still clung to the lower edge. The hammering had been close enough for Mrs. Raines to hear, yet she had not seen anyone arrive. Owen wrote "vacant" on a delivery notice and slipped it beneath the door. He told himself the county might be replacing emergency address markers. By the time he reached Irene's house, that explanation no longer fit. Her wooden number plate was gone. Irene stood behind the storm door while he checked the siding. 4 clean holes remained where the plate had been. "County take your number?" "County never brought me one." Owen told her to keep the door locked. She answered with a small movement of her chin, as though he had reminded her to breathe. At the post office, his supervisor called county addressing. No crew had been assigned to Pinehook. Owen filed a report and marked both houses on his route map. 2 days later, Walter Klein's number appeared on an empty trailer near Black Gum Road. Then the Sutter number turned up on a collapsed porch across from the old tipple. Each plate had been removed from an occupied home and attached to a vacant one farther down the route. Packages began following the numbers. A temporary driver left Irene's medicine at the Bell house. A grocery delivery, meant for Walter, sat overnight inside the empty trailer. Nothing valuable disappeared, but every mistake revealed something. The medicine showed who needed regular prescriptions. The grocery bags showed who lived alone and how much they ordered. Owen began checking every occupied address before sorting the truck. He used masking tape to write temporary numbers, but the tape was peeled away within a day. On Friday, he found a white stone resting on Mrs. Raines's mailbox. Another sat on Walter's porch step. A third had been placed beneath the Sutter gate. The stones were clean despite the wet road. Owen carried one to the post office. His supervisor turned it over in her palm. "Maybe survey markers," she said. "Surveyors carry paint." She placed the stone on her desk and did not argue. The following Monday, Owen heard a vehicle behind him near the abandoned Bell house. Its engine stayed low and steady through the curves. He could not see it through the trees. When he accelerated, the engine note rose. When he slowed for a washed-out shoulder, it dropped again. At the next intersection, Owen pulled aside. The sound stopped. He waited with both hands on the steering wheel. A crow moved through the branches above the road. Water ticked inside the culvert. After a full minute, a gray pickup rolled from a logging track behind him and passed without stopping. The driver wore a tan cap pulled low. Mud covered the rear plate. Owen saw the same truck twice that week. It was parked near vacant houses each time. On the third occasion, only its hood showed beyond a screen of rhododendron. The engine was off, but a thin line of exhaust drifted between the branches. He wrote down its description and gave it to a deputy. Without a visible plate or a clear view of the driver, there was little to trace. On Thursday afternoon, Owen carried Irene's medicine to her door instead of leaving it in the mailbox. She took the parcel but kept her hand on the knob. "Someone called last night," she said. "Asked when you come through. What did you tell them? That you never come the same time twice." It was not true. Owen reached Irene's house within the same 15-minute window, almost every Thursday. He returned to the Bell house after finishing the route. The winter light was already leaving the hollow. He parked where the truck could not be seen from Black Gum Road and walked toward the porch. The aluminum number was gone. Behind the house, crushed weeds led uphill through the trees. Owen followed them past a rusted water heater and the stone mouth of an old root cellar. The path was narrow but regularly used. Branches had been cut at shoulder height. Mud on the leaves showed deep heel marks. Halfway up the slope, he heard a brief rush of static. It came again several yards ahead, followed by a dispatcher's voice and the clipped answer of a deputy. Someone had a police scanner tuned low. Owen moved toward the sound until he saw a wall made from green canvas and branches. It formed a shallow blind beneath a sandstone ledge. From the front opening, a person could watch the road Mrs. Raines's porch and every vehicle entering Pinehook. The blind held a folding chair, binoculars, a thermos, and a plastic crate covered with a tarp. Inside the crate were 3 notebooks. Owen opened the first. Each page carried a resident's name and address. Beside the names were short entries written in pencil: Walter, doctor every second Tuesday, back by noon, Irene, medicine Thursday, no dog, Della, church Sunday morning, kitchen light after 5. The notes continued for every older resident on Owen's route. Some pages described door locks. Others listed relatives and how often their vehicles appeared. Small maps showed paths behind the houses and places where the road could be watched without being seen. The final notebook was labeled Carrier. Owen found the time he left the post office, the place he ate his first sandwich, and the gas station he used on Wednesdays. Someone had recorded which residents invited him inside during winter and how long he stayed. One entry described the 3 rubber bands around his wrist. Owen photographed the pages. His phone showed no service, but the pictures saved. He returned the notebooks exactly as he had found them. Below the ledge, a truck door closed. The sound traveled up the hollow, followed by boots moving through wet leaves. There was no hurry in the steps. Whoever was climbing already knew where the path ended. Owen slipped through the rear of the blind. The sandstone dropped sharply on that side. He lowered himself by a mountain laurel root and slid until his shoes reached loose shale. A man spoke from the other side of the canvas. Mailman. Owen kept moving. Shale rolled beneath him and clicked against the rocks below. He crossed the creek in water above his ankles and climbed toward Mrs. Raines's house without using the path. She opened the door when he struck the porch with both palms. Owen locked it behind him and called the sheriff from her kitchen phone. The gray pickup passed the house before the first deputy arrived. Mrs. Raines watched it through a gap in the curtains. "That one knows our road," she said. Deputies reached the blind less than an hour later. The chair, crate, notebooks, and scanner were gone. Fresh drag marks crossed the leaves, but the trail ended at an old mine road with several exits. They recovered the white stones and Owen's photographs. The truck was never identified. No fingerprint from the number plates matched anything in the state system. The moved addresses stopped after that evening. Nobody broke into the houses on Owen's route. Nothing disappeared except the notebooks and the small aluminum numbers. Owen continued carrying Pinehook for 6 more years. He stopped using the same lunch pull-off twice in 1 week. He removed the rubber bands from his wrist before leaving the post office. Every route sheet stayed folded inside his shirt pocket. Repetition makes an isolated road livable. It tells a person when medicine will arrive and when a familiar truck will turn the bend. It can also teach a patient watcher exactly when each porch will be empty. Owen still places every parcel beside the door instead of inside the mailbox. He does not drive away until the resident appears behind a window and raises one hand. Story 3. Tessa Cole could identify most problems on a school bus without opening the hood. A loose belt made a thin cry when the engine turned cold. A bad bearing produced a dry scrape that disappeared at higher speed. Air in a brake line had a soft cough to it. She spent weekdays in the county garage, listening for sounds that other people described as nothing. On Saturdays, she washed the grease from beneath her nails with dish soap and reported to the volunteer search team if the pager on her kitchen shelf called her out. Her search pack stayed beneath the coat rack beside the back door. Tessa repacked it every Sunday evening, even when the team had received no calls. Dry socks went inside a bread bag. Butterscotch candies filled the side pocket because lost children would sometimes speak after accepting one. She carried a carpenter's pencil instead of a pen. Pencils still worked after rain, and the flat sides kept them from rolling away when she set them on a map. At the top of the pack was a red knit cap her mother had made. Tessa never wore it. She used it to cover the hands of people who had been outside too long. The pager sounded at 6:12 on a November morning. Tessa was standing at the stove, turning a biscuit in a cast-iron pan. She switched off the burner, wrapped the biscuit in a dish towel, and placed it in the pocket of her field coat. Before leaving, she filled her cat's bowl, set the kitchen faucet to a slow drip, and wrote Haystack Mountain on the paper calendar beside the refrigerator. Her neighbor, Carol, had a key and knew that an uncrossed entry on the calendar meant Tessa was still in the woods. The search base occupied the gravel lot of a closed feed store. Portable lights shone through the morning mist. Volunteers drank coffee beside folding tables covered in maps. Hunters arriving to help kept their rifles locked in their vehicles. The missing boy was named Evan Pike. He was 16 and had entered the woods before daylight on Friday. His truck remained at the Haystack trailhead. He carried a small pack, a bottle of water, and a deer whistle his father had given him when he was 8. Evan's father stood beside the map table in a hunting coat, darkened by rain. He demonstrated the signal for the searchers, 2 short whistles, 1 long. "He knows to stay put," he said. The search coordinator, Marcus Vale, looked at the mountain behind him. Most people know that, until they think they recognize the way home. Tessa joined a team with Marcus and a younger volunteer named Rachel Boone. Their assigned grid covered the north side of Haystack, where an old logging road ended in a broad slope of mountain laurel. The shrubs grew higher than a person's head. Their branches crossed and hardened into walls. Deer moved through tunnels beneath them, but a standing adult often had to crawl. The team entered the woods shortly after 7. Rain from the previous night dripped from the canopy. Each drop struck a different surface. Laurel leaves answered with hollow taps. Oak leaves gave a softer patter. Water falling into the creek produced a steady hiss that followed them uphill. Tessa walked last and tied strips of blue survey ribbon where the logging road divided. She folded each knot beneath itself so the loose end pointed back toward base. It was a habit she had learned from an old mine rescuer. In thick brush, an arrow on a screen showed direction. A ribbon showed which side of the tree a human hand had touched. Near noon, Rachel found the first print. It lay in mud beside a seep. The tread came from a hunting boot, and the right heel contained a triangular gap where the rubber had torn away. Marcus photographed it and radioed the base. Evan's father confirmed that one of the boy's boots had a damaged heel. The prints crossed the logging road and climbed toward the laurel. Their spacing was even. Evan had not been running. Tessa followed the line while Rachel marked each clear impression with a small red flag. The first whistle came at 12:40. 2 short notes traveled across the slope. A longer note followed. All 3 searchers stopped. The sound had come from behind them. Marcus raised his whistle and gave the standard reply. They waited. Water moved through the seep. A branch released a pocket of rain. 2 short notes answered from farther downhill. Then 1 long note. Marcus radioed the search base. Another team was clearing the lower grid, but none of its members had used a whistle. They had searched the area less than 20 minutes earlier. Tessa and the others turned back. The sound did not repeat. They found no fresh tracks below the logging road and no place where Evan's prints changed direction. When they returned to the seep, the trail remained clear. The damaged heel continued uphill. By mid-afternoon, the prints reached the mountain laurel. Evan had entered through a low opening where several branches had been pushed apart. Drops of water had been wiped from the leaves at shoulder height. Marcus crouched beside the entrance. He went in. Tessa looked at the thicket. Then something should come out. They removed their packs and entered one at a time. Inside, daylight turned green and weak. The laurel held the rain above them, releasing it when their shoulders touched the branches. Tessa could see only Rachel's boots and the red flag tied to the back of her coat. Evan's tracks followed a narrow animal path. Mud filled the tread marks without covering the triangular gap. Tessa counted each print because counting prevented her from trusting a direction she could not see. At 34, the trail ended. The last boot print stood in a patch of black soil beneath an arch of branches. There was no second print beside it. No heel had turned. No knee or hand had disturbed the ground. Marcus pushed through the shrubs ahead. The branches were woven tightly enough to lift his jacket at the shoulders. Rachel searched both sides on her hands and knees. They found no exit. Above the final print, wet spiderwebs stretched between the leaves. Nothing had climbed through them. Rachel sat back on her heels. He did not walk away from this. A whistle sounded beyond her. 2 short notes, 1 long. It came from deeper inside the laurel, close enough for Tessa to hear air break against the whistle's edge. Marcus called Evan's name. The 3 of them pushed toward the sound. Branches scraped their coats and closed behind them. Tessa marked the route with blue ribbon, but the knots were difficult to reach in the cramped space. The whistle moved ahead. Whenever they stopped, it gave the same 3 notes. Whenever they advanced, it waited. The tone never changed with distance. It remained clear and dry despite the wet leaves around them. After 10 minutes, Tessa noticed a blue ribbon tied to a branch on her right. The loose end pointed away from base. She touched the knot. It was folded beneath itself exactly as she tied hers. Water had not yet gathered on the upper surface. "We crossed our path," she said. Marcus checked his compass. They had been moving north. Their earlier route lay south and below them. Rachel stared at the ribbon. "That was not here when we passed." The whistle came from behind them. Marcus ordered the team out. They followed Tessa's original ribbons, checking each knot before moving. The laurel resisted their packs and pulled at their radio antennas. Several times, the creek sounded close enough to touch, though the map placed it hundreds of yards downhill. They emerged near the last boot print just before dusk. Evan's tracks were still there. Something else had changed. A fresh blue ribbon hung above the final impression. Tessa had no ribbon missing from her roll. They returned to base after dark. Marcus documented the print and both unexpected markers. Additional teams surrounded the thicket through the night. They heard the whistle at different times from different grids. Each report placed it behind a team or inside ground already searched. No one saw Evan. At dawn, Tessa returned with Rachel and 2 state officers. The rain had stopped. The forest gave off small sounds that had been hidden the day before. Mice moved under leaves. Water dripped inside hollow logs. Far below, a truck door closed at the command post. The final boot print remained sharp beneath the laurel. One officer suggested that Evan had stepped backward into his own tracks. Tessa tried the movement beside the trail. Her heel widened the print and left a second mark where she shifted her weight. Evan's impression showed neither. The whistle sounded from the eastern edge of the thicket. The officers moved toward it. Tessa and Rachel followed. This time they found a shallow depression hidden beneath the laurel. Broken boards lay under years of leaves. A rusted pipe rose from the soil and ended at ankle height. The whistle came through the pipe. 2 short notes trembled inside the metal. 1 long note followed. The pipe carried the sound upward from somewhere below the mountain. Searchers cleared the leaves and found the remains of a capped ventilation shaft from an abandoned coal mine. The county maps showed no connection between that mine and Haystack Mountain, but old workings often extended beyond their recorded boundaries. A mine rescue crew arrived before noon. They lowered a camera through a gap beside the pipe. The shaft descended through loose rock and ended in brown water. No pack, clothing, or footprints appeared below. While the crew worked, another whistle sounded from the logging road they had cleared that morning. Rachel heard it first. She turned toward Tessa, but did not lift her own whistle. The search continued for 9 days. Dogs followed Evan's scent from his truck to the seep, then lost it at the edge of the laurel. Teams searched the mine entrances, creeks, ridges, and abandoned houses. Tessa crawled through the thicket 3 more times. She never found the extra blue ribbons again. Evan Pike remained missing. His father returned to the trailhead each year on the first Friday of November. He brought the same deer whistle, but never blew it. He placed it on the hood of his truck and waited until the sun left Haystack Mountain. Tessa stayed with the search team. She continued repairing buses and crossing entries from the calendar when she returned home. The team issued her a new roll of survey ribbon, but she kept it sealed in her pack. Sound is supposed to give a searcher a direction and a reason to keep moving. In the deep hollows, it can cross a ridge without carrying anything else with it. Whenever a whistle travels through the woods now, Tessa lowers her own and waits until she can see the person who made the sound. Story 4. Wade Hensley kept a roll of black electrical tape in every room of his house. One repaired the handle of the refrigerator. Another held the battery cover on the television remote. A third sat beside the kitchen phone because his daughter, Emery, liked to twist short pieces into rings when she visited. The morning after the storm, Wade found a strip of tape folded around the handle of his green thermos. Emery had written, "Be careful," on it with a silver marker. She was 12 and had spent the night with her mother across town, where the power had returned before dawn. Wade photographed the note before peeling it off. Then he filled the thermos, packed 2 ham biscuits, and stepped outside. Rain still fell from the trees even though the sky had cleared. Branches covered the road. The mountains beyond Wade's yard looked rubbed thin by mist. Somewhere down the hollow, a chainsaw started and stopped. The Black Ridge Electric Cooperative had received more than 800 outage reports overnight. Wind had pulled lines down across 3 counties. Wade met his partner, Ellis Moore, at the service yard before sunrise. They loaded insulators, fuses, crossarms, and enough cable to rebuild a mile of damaged line. Ellis checked the compartments from left to right. Wade checked them from right to left. They had worked together long enough to stay out of each other's way without discussing it. Before leaving, Wade sent Emery a photograph of the bucket truck. "Find me a porch light," she replied. It was their storm shift habit. Whenever Wade restored an isolated line, he photographed the first house that lit up. Emery kept the pictures in an album labeled "Places Dad Turned Back On." Their assignment took them into Low Briar Hollow, where a single distribution line followed an abandoned logging road. 23 homes waited beyond it. Most belonged to older residents who heated with wood but needed electricity for well pumps and medical equipment. The road narrowed after Pritchard's store. Fallen leaves hid the edges. Each time the truck passed beneath a bent tree, wet branches dragged over the roof like handfuls of gravel. Wade knew the line nearly as well as he knew the road to his own house. He had replaced Mrs. Carver's meter after a bear pulled conduit from her porch. He had carried a new well fuse to the Rusk place during a snowstorm because the bucket truck could not climb the drive. Near the cemetery, a boy named Daniel always waited by the fence to watch the boom rise. Wade kept a pair of clean work gloves in the cab for him, though Daniel's hands had not yet grown large enough to fill the fingers. Storm shifts followed a private rhythm for Wade and Ellis. Ellis drove the first half while Wade listed damaged poles on the back of his lunch wrapper. At noon, they traded seats. The passenger kept the thermos between his boots so it would not roll beneath a pedal. Neither man played the radio in the upper hollows. Loose branches and sagging wire often announced themselves first through the roof. They found the first broken pole near a washed-out culvert. A red oak had fallen across the line and pulled the crossarm sideways. The conductors lay slack in the weeds. Wade confirmed the line was dead, grounded it, and began clearing limbs. Ellis operated the bucket while Wade worked the saw. The forest filled with engine noise, chain teeth, and branches striking the ground. When the saw stopped, Wade heard 3 knocks. They came from uphill. Each knock was separated by the same short pause. Wood struck wood, but the sound was deeper than a woodpecker and too measured for a falling branch. Ellis removed his ear protection. "You hear that?" 3 knocks answered from farther along the line. They walked to a hollow chestnut standing at the edge of the right-of-way. Lightning had opened the trunk years earlier. The inside was black and wide enough for Wade to place his arm through the split. He shone a light inside. Rainwater lay at the bottom. No animal moved. "Loose limb," Ellis said. There was no wind. They returned to the pole and worked until noon. Wade set the new crossarm while Ellis replaced a cracked insulator. Whenever their tools stopped, another set of knocks came from the woods. The sound moved ahead of them, always near the next damaged span. At 1, they drove back to Pritchard's store for fuel and something warm to eat. The store smelled of kerosene, coffee, and damp coats. Pearl Van sat behind the register beneath a calendar from a funeral home. She was past 80 and had lived in Low Briar longer than the electric line. Ellis mentioned the knocking while Pearl spooned soup into paper cups. She stopped with the ladle above the pot. 3 at a time? Wade nodded. Pearl lowered the ladle. Keep your hammer in your belt. Do not send 3 back. Ellis smiled, but Pearl had already turned toward the shelves. The next damaged pole stood 2 miles deeper in the hollow. Its base looked sound, though the top leaned toward the road. Wade used his lineman's hammer to test for internal rot. He normally struck a pole 3 times at waist height and listened to the return. Solid timber gave a sharp answer. Decay absorbed the blow. Pearl's warning had followed him from the store. Wade struck once, walked around the pole, and struck twice more. The pole answered with 3 knocks from somewhere above his head. Ellis looked up. That your echo? Wade placed 1 palm against the wood. A faint vibration moved down the grain and stopped beneath his fingers. They inspected the pole again. No branch touched it. No hardware was loose. The line remained grounded. Wade marked the pole for replacement. Clouds had gathered above the ridge by late afternoon. The new front was not supposed to arrive until midnight, but thunder rolled beyond the western slope. Radio service faded as the truck entered the upper hollow. The final outage lay beyond an empty church and a cemetery surrounded by leaning wire. A fallen pine had snapped the line between 2 poles. 1 conductor rested across the church roof. Wade and Ellis grounded the section from both sides. Ellis drove back toward Pritchard's for another spool of cable, while Wade trimmed the pine and prepared the nearest pole. The bucket truck idled beside the church. Its warning beacon turned slowly, washing the wet trunks in amber light. Beyond the engine, the woods made no sound. No birds shifted in the branches. Even the runoff beside the road had disappeared beneath the leaves. 3 knocks came from a hollow maple near the cemetery. Wade kept working. 3 more came from an oak beside the church steps. The distance between the trees was nearly 50 yards. The second answer arrived before the last vibration of the first had faded. Wade tightened a clamp and reached for the cable cutter. The wooden pole beneath his bucket knocked 3 times. The bucket moved slightly against its hydraulic arm. Wade looked down. The pole was a treated pine installed less than 5 years earlier. It had no hollow section. His truck stood alone beside it. He radioed Ellis. Static broke Ellis's reply into pieces. Coming back was all Wade understood. The knocking resumed along the right-of-way. It began near the cemetery and moved toward him 1 pole at a time. 3 knocks in maple, 3 in oak, 3 inside the older cedar pole across from the church. Each group arrived closer than the last. Wade lowered the bucket. Halfway down, the control lever stiffened. The bucket stopped beside the crossarm. Wade pressed the descent switch again. The hydraulic pump whined, but the arm did not move. Thunder rolled over the ridge. The dead conductor lying across the church roof lifted several inches and settled again. Wade checked the wind. The trees remained still. 3 knocks sounded inside the bucket wall beside his left knee. He gripped the rim. The fiberglass surface gave no vibration. The same 3 knocks came from the tool compartment at his feet. Wade reached toward the compartment, then stopped. Pearl's voice returned with the smell of kerosene and soup. Do not send 3 back. He removed his hammer and pressed it flat against his thigh so the metal head could not strike anything. Then he held the descent switch with his other hand. The pump strained. The bucket dropped an inch. 3 knocks sounded from the pole. Wade kept the switch down. Hydraulic fluid squealed through the arm. The bucket descended in short, uneven movements until it reached the truck bed. The moment Wade stepped onto the ground, every hollow tree along the right-of-way answered together. The sound was not loud. It traveled through the wet timber as a single pattern repeated at different distances. 3 close knocks. 3 softer ones. 3 more fading toward the ridge. Wade entered the cab and locked both doors. The knocking continued beyond the windows. It moved past the church and down the road toward Pritchard's store. The amber beacon turned over empty trunks. Nothing crossed the right-of-way. Ellis returned 10 minutes later. By then, the woods held only rain dripping from the power line. They inspected the bucket controls and found a pinched hydraulic hose. Ellis replaced it beneath the work lights. The dead conductor on the church roof had shifted because a cut branch was slowly rolling from the shingles. Both explanations were enough for the report. They finished the repair shortly before midnight. When Ellis closed the final switch, porch lights appeared one by one along the hollow. Wade photographed the first. It belonged to a white house beside the cemetery. He sent the picture to Emery. She replied after a minute, "Why are there 3 lights in the woods behind it?" Wade enlarged the photograph. Beyond the house, 3 pale spots stood between the trees. They could have been rain on the lens. They could have been reflections from the truck beacon. He deleted the picture and sent Emery another from farther down the road. The next morning, Wade stopped at Pritchard's store. Pearl listened while he described the pole, the bucket, and the sounds moving through the trees. She placed his change beside the register. "You brought your hammer home?" Wade touched the tool hanging from his belt. Pearl pushed the coins toward him. "Then leave the rest where you heard it." Wade continued working storm damage for the cooperative. He climbed poles in low briar many times after that night. He never heard the pattern there again. He also stopped sounding poles in groups of 3. Wood carries weather, insects, loose hardware, and the blows of a worker standing farther along the line. A person cannot always tell which part of the forest returned the sound. Wade now strikes every pole twice, walks to the other side, and strikes twice again. If a third knock comes while his hammer is still against his leg, he lowers the bucket and leaves the pole for daylight. Story 5. June Mercer made 1 biscuit every morning. The recipe had been written for 12, but she had divided it until the measurements fit the small blue bowl beside her stove. 2 spoonfuls of flour, a pinch of salt, enough buttermilk to make the dough hold together. She baked the biscuit in a cast-iron skillet no wider than her hand. Her husband, Graham, had eaten 4 at breakfast and carried 2 more into the woods. After he died, June continued making the full batch for nearly a month. She froze what she could, gave bags to neighbors, and watched the rest harden inside a bread box. The single biscuit came later. It was one of the first arrangements she made with the quiet house. The Mercer property covered more than 300 acres along Laurel Fork. Graham's grandfather had logged the first ridge with mules. His father brought in skidders and built a gravel road through the upper timber. Graham closed that road 9 years before his death, after the last cutting contract ended. Poplar and birch had grown through its ruts. A steel gate remained locked beside the county lane. June lived in the original family house below the first slope. The porch leaned slightly toward the creek. Rain gathered at one end of the gutter and poured into a barrel Graham had painted green. June used that water for the ferns he had dug from a road bank during their first year of marriage. Her days followed small boundaries. She fed the birds before breakfast. She opened the curtains in the front room, but left the ones in Graham's study closed. On Tuesdays, she drove to town for groceries. On Fridays, Graham's younger brother, Lowell, brought eggs and checked whatever June had written on a yellow pad beside the refrigerator. Each Sunday, June walked as far as the locked logging gate. She carried pruning shears and cut blackberry canes away from the hinges. Graham had oiled the lock every spring, and June continued doing it with the same dented can from his workbench. Timber buyers called twice a year asking about the upper ridge. She wrote their names on envelopes and placed them beneath the telephone, but she never called back. The young forest had begun hiding the old work. Ferns covered the cable ruts. Saplings grew through a skidder tire left beside the road. June liked watching the mountain close what the Mercer men had opened. Loose kitchen hinge, mouse sign in pantry, north gutter dripping again. Lowell repaired each problem without taking off his coat. He never sat in Graham's chair. The first chain came shortly before dawn on a Monday. June woke to metal dragging over gravel. The sound began near the woodshed behind the house. Heavy links scraped across stones, paused near the back steps, then continued along the side yard. June sat up and listened as it passed beneath her bedroom window. She knew the sound. Graham had used a logging chain to pull storm-fallen trees from the road. He kept it coiled in the tool shed. When he dragged it toward the tractor, one hook struck the links at every other step. The rhythm moved around the house now with the same uneven beat. Scrape, step, scrape, clink. June crossed the room and lifted the curtain with one finger. The yard was empty. Frost covered the grass. The woodshed door remained closed. The chain moved beyond the front porch and returned toward the rear of the house. By the time June reached the kitchen, the sound had completed a full circle. Then it stopped. She turned on every outside light. No chain lay in the yard. The frost showed rabbit tracks, bird marks, and the narrow path June had worn between the porch and the woodshed. Nothing circled the house. After sunrise, she unlocked the tool shed. Graham's logging chain hung from 2 iron hooks on the wall. Dust covered its upper links. A spiderweb connected one hook to the wooden stud. June closed the door and made her biscuit. The sound returned the next morning at the same hour. This time, June carried a flashlight to the back door. She waited until the dragging passed beneath the kitchen window, then opened the door. Cold air entered. The sound stopped beside the porch. June shone the light across the yard. Frost brightened on the grass. The beam reached the first line of trees and found only trunks. She closed the door. The chain resumed from the opposite side of the house. June kept one hand on the knob. Her nails pressed shallow crescents into the paint. On Friday, she told Lowell. He listened from the kitchen table while she described the route the sound took. His coffee remained untouched between his hands. Maybe a branch against the foundation, he said. Branches do not walk around corners. Lowell checked beneath the porch, along the gutter, and around the woodshed. He found a loose length of wire beside the rain barrel, but it could not reach the ground. June showed him the logging chain. Lowell lifted it from the hooks. The links settled against one another with the same low clatter June had heard outside. "Take it with you," she said. He placed the chain in the bed of his truck and covered it with a tarp. Before leaving, Lowell stood beside the locked gate and examined the mud. "If you hear it again, call me before you go outside." The chain returned on Saturday morning. It moved more slowly. Each link seemed to catch in the gravel before pulling free. The sound passed the empty woodshed, crossed beneath June's window, and continued around the porch. The logging chain was 16 miles away in Lowell's garage. June called him without leaving her bed. He answered on the 4th ring. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The chain scraped beneath the wall between them. "I hear it through your phone," Lowell said. That sentence left June sitting upright long after the sound stopped. Lowell came before breakfast. He walked the yard while June watched from the porch. Near the north corner of the house, he found a shallow line through the frost. It was no wider than a finger and extended about 6 feet before disappearing in the grass. There were no prints beside it. Lowell installed 2 trail cameras that afternoon. One faced the woodshed. The other watched the front porch and lower driveway. He marked the locked gate with a strand of red thread tied between the chain and post. For 3 mornings, June heard nothing. She slept until daylight and began leaving Graham's study curtains open. On Tuesday, she drove to town and stayed long enough to drink coffee at the pharmacy counter. The sound returned on Wednesday at 4:30. June reached for the notebook she had begun keeping beside the bed. Gate locked, chain with Lowell, back door bolted. Awake before sound began. She wrote the final line twice. The dragging completed 1 circle, then another. On the 3rd pass, the hook struck each porch support as it went by. Clink beneath the kitchen, clink beneath the front steps, clink beneath the bedroom. June pressed the heels of both hands over her ears. The sound still reached her through the mattress frame and floorboards. At daylight, Lowell checked the cameras. The woodshed camera had recorded 6 hours of an empty yard. Its microphone captured the chain clearly. The sound approached from behind the camera, moved past it, and continued toward the house. Nothing entered the frame. The porch camera stopped recording at 4:28 and resumed at 4:41. Its battery remained full. The red thread on the gate was unbroken. Lowell wanted June to stay at his house. She packed a small case and went with him for a week. The first 2 nights, she slept in his daughter's old room. Traffic moved along the highway beyond the window. A furnace started beneath the floor. No metal crossed the gravel outside. On the 3rd morning, June woke before dawn and found Lowell standing in the hallway. "You hear anything?" she asked. He looked toward the attached garage. From behind the closed door came the slow settling of heavy links. They opened the garage together. Graham's chain remained beneath the tarp in the truck bed. Lowell uncovered it. The links were wet. Rain had not fallen for 5 days. June returned home the following morning. She told Lowell that if the sound belonged to the land, sleeping beside a highway would not change where it began. She carried the logging chain back to the tool shed herself. Instead of hanging it on the wall, she laid it across the concrete floor in a straight line. She placed a square of newspaper beneath every 5th link. If the chain moved, the paper would wrinkle or tear. The next morning, the dragging began behind the house. June did not leave her bed. She followed its progress by sound. It passed the woodshed, reached the north corner, and moved beneath her window. The pace was slower than before. At the front porch, it stopped. One link lifted, then another. The chain sounded as if it were being gathered directly outside the front door. June walked into the hallway. She wore Graham's old wool socks, and her feet made no sound on the boards. The metal continued piling against the threshold. The door did not shake. The knob did not turn. Through the narrow window beside it, June could see the empty porch and pale yard. She placed her palm against the door. The chain gave one final pull and became still. June waited until sunlight reached the porch before opening it. A thin groove crossed the frost from the front steps to the locked logging road. It passed under the steel gate and continued into the young trees growing between the old tire ruts. No footprints appeared on either side. In the tool shed, Graham's chain remained straight across the floor. Every square of newspaper lay flat beneath its link. The dragging did not return the following morning. Weeks passed. Winter covered the old road with snow, then spring rain opened the creek. June stayed on the Mercer property. She replaced the trail camera batteries and kept the notebook beside her bed. Some mornings, she found herself awake at 4:30, with the pencil already in her hand. The sound still returns once or twice each year. It always circles the house before daylight. Lowell has heard it from the kitchen and from the yard. Neither of them has seen what makes it. A repeated sound can draw a boundary as clearly as a fence. It teaches a person which rooms feel farther from the trees and which hour belongs to the land outside. Every evening, June enters the tool shed and lays Graham's chain flat across the concrete, leaving a separate square of newspaper beneath every 5th link. Story 6. Eli Garrison wrote his name on everything he carried underground. His field notebook had ELI printed across the cover in white paint. His flashlight, gas meter, water bottle, and folding rule carried smaller versions in black marker. Even his lunch bag had a cloth label sewn beneath the handle. The habit came from his father, who had worked the Deep Run mine for 31 years. Curtis Garrison claimed that an unmarked tool belonged to whoever found it. Eli had grown up watching him label wrenches, thermoses, gloves, and the small metal boxes that held blasting caps. Eli did not become a miner. He became a reclamation specialist for the state. Most of his work happened above ground. He inspected sealed portals, measured contaminated drainage, and checked hillsides where underground rooms had begun pulling the surface down. When a yard cracked or a creek disappeared into old workings, Eli arrived with maps, orange flags, and a camera. He liked the patient parts of the job. He could spend an hour tracing a wet seam through shale. He kept samples in glass jars and wrote the location on the lid and the side. At home, his daughter Rowan used the empty jars for buttons and beach glass. She crossed out his labels but left his name. Each morning, Rowan packed his lunch while he made coffee. She was 17 and believed his meals needed improvement. She labeled the bag only after checking the weather. On rainy days, she covered the ink with clear tape. On cold days, she drew a small flame beside Eli's name and added an extra packet of crackers. Eli pretended not to notice the drawings when his co-workers saw them. He kept every label in the glove compartment after the bag wore out. Once a month, Rowan removed the collection and taped the best ones to the refrigerator in rows. Before difficult inspections, Eli called her from the truck. Their conversations rarely lasted more than a minute. He told her where he had parked and when he expected to return. Rowan answered with whatever she was doing at home: feeding the dog, washing paint from a jar, looking for a library book beneath the couch. Ordinary details gave Eli something above ground to picture while he worked below it. On the day the sinkhole opened, she replaced his usual ham sandwich with cold noodles and taped a plastic fork to the bag. "Try one new thing," she had written beneath his name. Eli ate half the noodles in the truck and saved the rest for later. The call came from a reclaimed mine site near Whitlow Branch. 3 days of rain had opened a depression in the slope above an abandoned coal camp. The hole was nearly 12 feet across and deep enough that the landowner could not see the bottom. Eli met the regional engineer, Delia Park, beside a rusted gate. Delia wore a yellow raincoat over her coveralls and carried a map tube beneath one arm. "This was filled in 1994, she said. Eli looked through the gate. "The mountain disagrees." They walked uphill through wet goldenrod. The reclaimed slope had been graded smooth decades earlier, but young trees now leaned toward the new opening. Mud slipped inward around their roots. Before Eli reached the edge, he heard metal strike metal below. One short ring traveled out of the hole. A pause followed. Then came the sound of a latch closing. Delia stopped beside him. "Rock does not latch." They approached on safety lines anchored to a white oak. The sinkhole descended through red clay into broken shale. About 20 feet down, one wall opened into a dark horizontal space. Air moved from it in slow, cool breaths. Old mines usually smelled of wet stone, sulfur, timber rot, or standing water. The air rising from this opening carried soap and weak coffee. Eli lowered a camera. The image showed a narrow corridor supported by concrete blocks. Mud covered the floor near the collapse, but farther inside it ended at a straight line. Beyond that line, the floor looked swept. The camera cable reached 40 feet before the picture failed. Delia pulled it back. Brown water coated the lens. A fine gray thread had wound around the cable, though neither of them had seen fabric below. They fenced the sinkhole and called a mine rescue team. That afternoon, Eli searched archived maps at the district office. The collapse lay above the Whitlow No. 4 mine, which had closed after an underground fire in 1977. 9 men working beyond the east mains had never reached the surface. Recovery crews sealed the affected section when heat and bad air made further entry impossible. The official map showed no room beneath the sinkhole. An older hand-drawn plan included a narrow line marked supply passage. It ended near the collapse but did not connect to any labeled chamber. Eli found the names of the missing men in an inspection report: Arthur Bell, Leon Caskey, Matthew Doss, Glenn Foster, Samuel Height. The list continued for 4 more lines. Eli copied each name into his field notebook. The rescue team arrived the next morning. Gas readings at the opening remained safe. The slope had stopped moving overnight, though rainwater continued slipping through cracks in the clay. Delia stayed at the surface to monitor the line. Eli descended with a rescue technician named Jonah Reed. Both men wore harnesses and carried independent air monitors. The corridor began at the bottom of the sinkhole. Concrete block replaced the rough mine wall after several yards. The blocks were dry. White paint covered them from floor to ceiling. Their boots left the first marks on the gray floor. Eli heard a clock ticking ahead. The sound remained steady as they moved. It did not echo like water. Each tick ended cleanly before the next began. The corridor opened into a rectangular room. 4 tables stood beneath hanging lights. The lights were dark, but their shades had no dust. Wooden chairs had been pushed beneath the tables in even rows. A broom rested beside a metal trash can. Its bristles were clean. Ceramic mugs hung from hooks beside a sink. Each mug had a different stain around the rim. The faucet gave 1 drop while Eli watched, though no water line appeared on the mine plan. A bulletin board held a safety notice, a grocery advertisement, and a calendar open to October of 1977. None of the paper had curled in the damp air. Someone had wiped the tables recently enough to leave overlapping marks in the thin moisture on their surfaces. Eli drew one gloved finger through a mark. The wood beneath it was smooth and cool. A gray rag lay folded beside the sink, darker along one edge as if it had been rinsed and wrung out. On the far wall, a clock showed 11:20. Its second hand moved. Jonah aimed his light at the back. Battery clock. Ellie looked at the cord hanging beneath it. The clock had no battery compartment. Along the left wall, metal lunchboxes stood on a shelf. There were 9. Each had been wiped clean. Some were red or blue. Others showed bare metal where years of use had worn away the paint. Strips of white tape had been fixed beneath the handles. Names were written on the tape: Arthur Bell, Leon Caskey, Matthew Doss. Eli took out his notebook. The order matched the list he had copied, including a misspelling in Samuel Height's last name. Jonah called the surface. His radio carried Delia's reply through heavy static. "Photograph and leave," she said. Eli photographed the room from the doorway. Then he stepped closer to the shelf. The first lunchbox was unlatched. Inside lay a thermos cup, a folded paper napkin, and an apple core that had not darkened. A small mound of salt rested in one corner of the napkin. The next box contained a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. The bread pressed beneath Eli's gloved finger and rose again. He closed the lid. A chair scraped across the floor in the corridor, behind them. Both men turned. Their lights met on the empty passage. The chair beside the nearest table now stood several inches away from its edge. Eli could not remember whether it had been that way when they entered. The clean floor showed a pale line beneath one rear leg. Jonah moved toward the corridor. "We are done." The clock stopped ticking. In the quiet that followed, a metal latch opened somewhere beyond the far wall. Then another opened. The sounds continued one by one, each slightly farther away. Eli counted 6 before Delia's voice broke through the radio. "Your line is moving. Come out." They left the room. Halfway down the corridor, Eli heard the chairs begin to move. Several legs dragged across the clean floor at once. The sound remained behind them and did not increase in volume. At the collapse, loose shale had begun spilling from the ceiling. Jonah climbed first. Eli waited beneath the rope while dirt struck his helmet and rolled past his shoulders. The corridor exhaled a colder stream of air. From the room came the clear ring of a shift bell. Eli looked back once. His headlamp reached the straight line where the mud ended. Beyond it, the swept floor showed a row of dark prints. They faced the sinkhole. None had been there when he entered. Delia hauled tension into Eli's line. He climbed while the opening narrowed beneath falling clay. The last thing he heard underground was the clock beginning to tick again. The eastern wall of the sinkhole collapsed minutes after Eli reached the surface. Shale filled the corridor entrance. No one was injured. The photographs survived. They showed the tables, the clock, and 9 lunchboxes bearing the names of the missing miners. State officials closed the site and began planning a larger excavation. Before work could begin, a retired Whitlow miner named Abe Collins contacted Eli. Abe had worked the morning the fire started. He studied printed copies of the photographs at the district office. His finger stopped over the red lunchbox labeled Arthur Bell. "I carried these out myself," Abe said. Eli waited. The boxes were in the bathhouse. Those men had already eaten. The original lunchboxes had been returned to families after the mine closed. 2 still existed in private collections. Their dents and worn paint matched the boxes in Eli's photographs. Engineers drilled test holes around the sinkhole. Every core showed solid backfill, where the corridor should have continued. Cameras lowered through the borings, found mud, fractured rock, and no open room. The state filled the collapse with grout and covered the slope with stone. The room remained below it, or behind it, or nowhere the new holes could reach. Eli continued working reclamation sites. He still labeled his equipment, but he stopped carrying food into mine openings. His lunch stayed in the truck, no matter how long an inspection lasted. Underground rooms can preserve the outline of labor long after the workers and maps are gone. A chair, A clock and a named lunchbox can make an abandoned shift seem paused instead of finished. Before Eli descends below grade, he leaves his lunch on the passenger seat with the cloth label turned toward the windshield. Story 7. Maren Holt closed campsites in the same order every autumn. She started with the river loop, where families left tent stakes hidden beneath the leaves. Then she moved uphill to the ridge loop and turned each picnic table upside down so snow would not split the boards. The group field came last because her dog, Moss, liked to run circles through the empty grass while Maren checked the fire rings. Moss was an old black and white cattle dog with one folded ear. He carried a faded orange ball from site to site, but refused to release it unless Maren offered a piece of dried apple. She kept the apple in the breast pocket of her uniform and the ball beneath the driver's seat at night. The Alder Run campground closed to visitors in early November. Maren remained through the winter as caretaker. She lived in a small trailer beside the entrance and handled storm damage, trespass reports, and weekly checks of the water system. She liked the campground best when no one was staying there. Empty sites kept the shapes of the people who had used them. Pale squares remained where tents had covered the ground. Stones appeared in careful circles beside the creek. Children sometimes left chalk drawings beneath picnic tables where rain could not reach. Maren photographed those drawings before washing them away in spring. The entrance station held a shelf of things campers had forgotten. A child's red rain boot, 3 pocket knives, a coffee mug painted with a crooked bear. Maren dated each object with masking tape and kept it for 1 full season before donating it. She had once mailed a stuffed rabbit across 2 states after recognizing it in a family photograph. The child sent back a drawing of Moss wearing a ranger hat. Maren taped it above the weather radio where the corners had begun to curl. On quiet afternoons, she repaired numbered campsite posts in the maintenance shed. Moss slept beneath the workbench and woke whenever she opened the tin containing dried apple. Maren painted each number twice, then turned the post upside down to check for rot. She did not like sending visitors toward anything she had not inspected herself. Every morning, she heated water on a propane stove and added cinnamon to instant coffee. Moss received half a boiled egg in his food. While he ate, Maren called her supervisor, Dean Sutter, and read the creek gauge painted on the bridge support. 2 feet and clear, she might say. Dean always answered, "Keep it that way." It was the closest either of them came to a joke before breakfast. The storm arrived on a Thursday night. Rain struck the trailer roof hard enough to cover the sound of the radio. Weather alerts warned of flash flooding across the county. Maren moved the utility cart to higher ground, checked the generator fuel, and walked Moss one last time before the creek rose. They passed the lower bathhouse near the river loop. The building had been winterized the previous week. Maren had drained the pipes, locked every window, and fastened a steel padlock through the front doors. She pulled the lock twice while Moss waited beneath the overhang. The tiled rooms inside were dry. By dawn, the creek had crossed the campground road. Maren heard boulders moving beneath the water before she saw the flood. They rolled against one another with slow impacts that traveled through the ground. When daylight reached the river loop, brown water covered the lowest fire rings and lifted branches against the picnic tables. She radioed Dean from the entrance station. "The culvert is gone," she said. Static broke around his reply. "Stay above gauge 6. Rescue cannot cross until the water drops." The main road had disappeared beneath a moving sheet of mud and limbs. Maren's truck sat on the campground side. She and Moss were cut off from the county highway. They began moving uphill. Maren carried food, blankets, the radio, and a small medical kit to the ridge shelter. Moss followed with his orange ball until thunder sounded beyond the trees. Then he dropped it and walked against Maren's leg. On their second trip, they passed the locked bathhouse. Wet boots crossed the tile inside. The steps moved from the men's room toward the central utility hall. Each one landed with a flat slap, followed by a short squeak of water beneath the sole. Moss stopped, his ears lifted. The fur along his shoulders separated into a dark line. The footsteps reached the far wall, turned and came back. Marin stood beneath the overhang and listened. The padlock remained fastened through both door handles. Mud around the entrance held only her prints and Moss's paws. She called through the door. The steps stopped on the other side. Marin raised the radio. Dean answered after several attempts. "Someone may be in the lower bathhouse. You locked it. I have the only key." Dean's voice faded, then returned. "Do not open it alone." Water struck something heavy near the river. A picnic table moved between the trees with one end lifted above the current. Marin led Moss uphill. The footsteps resumed before they reached the next campsite. For the rest of the morning, rain closed the distance between the creek and the road. Marin marked the waterline on trees with strips of yellow tape. Each new strip stood several yards uphill from the last. At noon, the lower bathhouse remained above water. The building sat on a raised concrete pad, but the river loop around it had become a shallow lake. Marin watched from the maintenance shed through binoculars. The doors stayed closed. No face appeared at the frosted windows. Every few minutes, Moss turned toward the bathhouse, as if hearing movement beneath the rain. During a brief break in the downpour, Marin walked close enough to inspect the building from the uphill side. All 4 windows remained latched. The padlock showed an unbroken stripe of rust beneath its shackle. Inside, the boots crossed the tile and paused beside each window as she passed it. Moss moved with his body against Marin's leg. When she stopped, the steps stopped. When she continued, one wet sole landed inside before her own boot touched the ground. Marin returned to the maintenance shed without circling the final wall. The power failed shortly after 1. Without the campground transformers, the woods lost their electrical hum. Marin heard water pushing through culverts, limbs rubbing together, and the distant warning beep from the generator panel. Then a toilet flushed inside the locked bathhouse. The water supply had been shut off for 8 days. Marin checked the valve beside the maintenance shed. It remained closed and tagged. Floodwater could have entered the sewer line and forced air through the traps. She repeated that explanation aloud while Moss watched her. The toilet flushed again. Wet boots crossed the tile from one end of the building to the other. By mid-afternoon, the creek reached gauge 6. Marin called Dean. His transmission arrived in broken pieces, but she understood ridge shelter and do not wait. The safest route climbed from the trailer past the bathhouse and crossed a wooden footbridge above a drainage channel. When Marin reached it, the channel had become a second creek. Water pressed against the bridge rails. A tree trunk struck the supports and turned sideways beneath them. The bridge shifted several inches downstream. Marin backed away. The alternate trail to the ridge began beyond the river loop, on the opposite side of the bathhouse. Water had entered the trailer by then. Her boots sank into cold mud near the steps. Moss climbed onto the utility cart and would not come down until Marin lifted him. The concrete pad beneath the bathhouse remained the highest ground in the lower campground. Marin carried the emergency pack toward it, while floodwater moved across the road behind her. Moss pulled against his leash. The footsteps inside were pacing faster. They crossed the tile, turned, and crossed again. Water squeaked under each step. The sound followed the same route without slowing. Marin reached the doors and inserted the key. The padlock opened. She removed it and held one door against the floodwater pressing over the concrete. The interior smelled of bleach and wet stone. Her flashlight reached rows of sinks, gray stall doors, and the utility hallway. No person stood inside. The tiled floor was damp from wall to wall. A single line of boot prints crossed the center of the room. They began near a floor drain and ended at the locked utility closet. Marin brought Moss inside and secured the front door with a metal bar. The dog pressed against her knees. His nails clicked whenever he shifted. The utility closet had no exterior entrance. Marin approached it with the flashlight held beside her face. Water moved beneath the door in a thin line. She unlocked the closet. The room contained the shut-off valves, cleaning supplies, and a ladder leading to a roof hatch. Nobody stood between the shelves. Marin climbed high enough to test the hatch. It opened beneath the rain. Below her, a wet boot stepped onto the tile outside the closet. The sound came without a visible foot. Moss gave one low bark. Another step crossed the room. then another. The prints on the floor did not change. Marin lifted Moss onto the first ladder step. He weighed nearly 50 pounds and twisted against her arms. She pushed from below until his front paws reached the roof opening. Floodwater struck the bathhouse doors. The metal bar bent inward. Marin climbed after Moss and pulled the hatch closed. They crawled across the flat roof while water surrounded the building. Picnic tables turned slowly between the trees. The footbridge broke free and passed downstream in 2 pieces. From below the roof came the steady crossing of wet boots. The steps moved through the bathhouse, while the river rose above the windows. They continued after water filled the doorway. Marin could hear them beneath the rain, pacing from one wall to the other. She and Moss remained on the roof until morning. A rescue crew reached them after the creek fell below the concrete pad. Moss climbed into the boat first. Marin followed with the emergency pack still strapped to her back. The bathhouse doors had been pushed inward by floodwater. The utility closet was empty. Mud covered the tile to a height of 4 feet. Searchers found no clothing, pack, or evidence that anyone had sheltered inside. The roof vents were too narrow for a person. The floor drain connected to a broken sewer line that opened near the creek. Dean suggested that pressure in the pipe had caused the flushing and some of the noises. He did not offer an explanation for the pacing, and Marin did not ask for one. The county rebuilt Alder Run the following spring. Marin returned as caretaker. Moss refused to enter the lower bathhouse, even after the floor and doors were replaced. Floodwater can make an empty building speak through drains, walls, and trapped air. It can carry sounds from places no one can safely search. Before Marin locks any campground bathhouse for the season, she spreads a thin line of white cleanser across every interior doorway and photographs the unbroken powder from outside. Story 8. Amos Reed recorded the first animal he saw each morning. He kept a narrow field notebook in the chest pocket of his uniform. The left page held patrol notes. The right page held the date, temperature, and one animal. Crow on courthouse wire, gray fox crossing Mill Road, 2 does below the cemetery. The list had begun when his daughter, Nora, was 6. She believed a game warden spent every day hiding behind trees and waiting for someone to break a law. Amos started bringing home proof that the woods contained more than violations. Nora was grown and living 3 counties away, but he still sent her a photograph of the page each Sunday. She corrected his bird names and drew circles around animals she wanted him to photograph. On the morning the rifle shots began, Amos wrote barred owl. The owl sat on a fence post beside the Gamelands office. It watched Amos check the tires on his truck, then moved into the trees without opening its wings wider than necessary. Deer season had started 4 days earlier. Amos's patrol area covered 3 ridges, 2 river valleys, and a network of old mining roads that rarely appeared on navigation screens. His calls involved blocked gates, untagged deer, shots after legal hours, and hunters who forgot where private property began. He kept spare hand warmers for hunters who stayed out past sunset, and a coil of rope for dogs caught in creek culverts. Every season, someone offered him venison in exchange for overlooking a mistake. Amos always declined, then explained how to donate legally tagged meat to the county pantry. At Christmas, the pantry director sent him a card signed by families who never knew which hunter had filled their freezer. Amos also carried 5 cheap orange caps in the truck. He gave them to teenagers whose camouflage covered every bright surface they owned. Nora bought a new stack for him each year and wrote "Return Home" beneath the brim of every cap. Most of the boys noticed only after they took them off. He knew the sound of the local rifles. A flat crack usually came from the open fields near Sutton Creek. A heavier report belonged to the large caliber rifles carried into the upper timber. Shotguns rolled through a hollow and broke apart against both slopes. Distance was harder. In the Appalachian ridges, a shot could cross one valley, strike a rock face, and return from behind the listener. Amos carried a compass, a paper map, and 3 sharpened pencils. His father had taught him never to trust a pen below freezing. He sharpened the pencils each morning over the trash can and left the curled shavings in one piece whenever he could. At noon, he ate crackers and smoked trout beside the truck. Nora had mailed the trout from a market near her apartment. She packed each piece between squares of wax paper and wrote instructions as if Amos had never eaten before. The first shot came at 4:13. Amos was checking an illegal salt block near Harlan Ridge. The rifle report sounded west of him. One clean crack crossed the hollow. The echo returned from the north slope. He wrote the time in his notebook. 7 minutes later, another shot came from farther west. The light was already draining from the valleys. Legal shooting time had nearly ended. Amos radioed dispatch and drove toward the old forest road below Marlow Ridge. The third shot came exactly 7 minutes after the second. It sounded beyond Marlow, near Raven Fork. Amos stopped the truck and listened. No engine moved on the logging roads. No voices carried through the trees. After the echo faded, the forest returned to the small, dry noises of late autumn. At the locked gate, Amos found no parked vehicle. Brown leaves lay unbroken across the road. The gate chain was rusted and secure. Raven Fork was part of a management tract closed to public entry for more than 30 years. Warning signs stood at every access road. Storm damage and mine subsidence provided the official reasons. Most local people connected the closure to the Harlan hunting party. 5 men had entered Raven Fork on the first morning of deer season in 1988. They planned to spread across 3 ridges and meet at their truck before dark. The truck remained at the gate for 12 days. Search teams found their camp, food, and sleeping bags. They found no hunters. The 5 rifles disappeared with them. During the first week of the search, volunteers reported rifle fire after dark. Each report came from a section cleared earlier that day. Officers blamed hunters on surrounding private land, and the reports disappeared into the back pages of the case file. The families returned every November for more than 20 years. They tied 5 strips of orange cloth to the Raven Fork gate and removed the faded ones from the year before. Local hunters began counting any evenly spaced shots they heard near the tract. Some called them echoes. Others packed their rifles and left before reaching the final number. Amos had never repeated either version while wearing his badge. Sound behaved badly in those ridges, and unfinished stories behaved worse. The 4th shot came from inside the closed tract. Amos checked the gate again. The chain had gathered red rust around each point of contact. Opening it would have left bright marks. He radioed Cass Wynn, the evening dispatcher. "Any authorized crews in Raven Fork?" Cass checked the log. "Nobody since spring. I have rifle fire." The next shot crossed the ridge before she answered. Cass returned to the radio. That one was 7 minutes. Amos removed the bolt cutters from his truck. The state gate was intended to keep vehicles out, not officers. Amos cut a smaller maintenance chain beside the hinge and opened the gate far enough to pass. He left his truck outside with the warning lights on. The road climbed through second-growth timber. Young poplars crowded the old tire ruts. Roots had lifted sections of gravel into low ridges. Amos walked with his flashlight off while the remaining daylight showed between the trunks. At 4:41, another rifle fired. The report came from the first ridge inside Raven Fork. Amos marked his position on the map. The shooter had moved more than a mile from the previous sound in 7 minutes. A vehicle could not have crossed the blocked road that quickly. A person on foot could not have climbed the intervening slope. He considered 2 shooters. At 4:48, the next shot came from the second ridge. Amos found a fresh brass casing beside the road. It rested upright between 2 leaves. He picked it up with a gloved hand. The metal was cold. Green corrosion filled the stamped letters at its base. He placed it in an evidence envelope and continued. The road passed an abandoned search camp. Rusted hooks remained in a tree where rescue crews had hung lanterns. Orange ribbon had faded to white along the edge of a clearing. An old man named Virgil Kane had led one of those crews. Amos had interviewed him years later for a training project. Virgil remembered hearing shots during the final nights of the search. "They always came from the ridge we had just cleared," he had said. At 4:55, a rifle fired from behind Amos. The sound came from near the locked gate. He turned. His truck warning lights flashed faintly through the trees below. Nothing crossed between them. Cass called over the radio. "Your locations are making a pattern." Amos unfolded the map against a tree. Cass read the coordinates he had reported. The first 3 shots formed a line across the outer ridges. The next 3 continued through Raven Fork. Amos drew the points with one of his sharpened pencils. They matched the planned positions of the missing hunters. The original search report listed where each man intended to wait: 1 on Harlan Ridge, 1 above Marlow, 3 spaced through Raven Fork. At 5:02, another shot came from the 3rd ridge. The intervals had not changed. Amos stood near the center of the old hunting party's route. He told Cass he was turning back. The forest road had grown dim enough for his flashlight. Its beam found white search ribbon, pale trunks, and occasional flakes of mica in the soil. The downhill direction should have kept the creek on his right. Water began moving on his left. Amos checked the compass. The needle settled north. He had not turned, but the road beneath his boots now climbed. At 5:09, a shot fired ahead of him. The muzzle report was close enough to separate from its echo. A dry branch dropped across the road several yards away. Amos lowered himself behind a fallen log. He did not see a flash. Leaves shifted on the slope above him. 1 step, a pause, another step. The movement continued parallel to the road. More leaves began shifting below him at the same pace. Amos kept the flashlight pointed at the ground. Cass called his name over the radio. He pressed the transmit button once so she would know the signal still reached him. The next 7 minutes passed without a shot. At 5:06, 5 rifles fired from separate ridges. The reports reached Amos in order: Harlan, Marlow, 1st Raven Ridge, 2nd, 3rd. Their echoes crossed above the hollow and returned together. Amos felt the vibration through the fallen log. Fine bark gathered beneath his palms. When the echoes ended, the footsteps on both slopes stopped. Amos stood and followed the creek instead of the road. Water could twist, but it eventually reached the county valley. He moved downhill through rhododendron, crossing the creek whenever the bank became too steep. No more shots sounded. He reached the gate after midnight. Cass had sent 2 wardens and a sheriff's deputy. They found Amos sitting on the front bumper of his truck with the field notebook open across his knees. The next morning, officers searched Raven Fork. The road showed Amos's boot prints and no others. The corroded casing in his envelope had been manufactured more than 40 years earlier. It matched the brand listed for 1 rifle carried by the Harlan party. Searchers found 4 more casings at the locations Amos had marked. Each matched a different rifle from the missing group. Moss and leaf mold filled them. None showed the bright scrape left by a recent firing pin. The officers heard no shots during daylight. Raven Fork remained closed. The maintenance chain was replaced, and a camera was mounted above the gate. It recorded deer, bears, falling leaves, and Amos's truck whenever he returned to check it. He never entered the tract alone again. Rifle reports can cross valleys and return from ground where no shooter stood. Wardens learned to separate the first crack from every answer the ridges send back. Amos now writes down the minute of every distant shot. If the next one arrives at the same interval, he stays beside his truck until another set of headlights reaches the gate.